The sight and sound of a Spitfire soaring in sunny skies never fails to lift the spirit. Its presence and beauty exhilarates both young and old. And as it streaks through the sky, it touches a collective nerve. For the Spitfire has come to represent the titanic struggle during the summer of 1940, when freedom itself hung in the balance. The Spitfire is more than just an aeroplane, it is an icon. Today, the Spitfire is always the centre of attention whenever it appears in public, and although they are often seen, they are something of a rarity. There are only about 50 flying examples in the world, and that's despite the fact that over 22,000 were built during the 12 years that it was in production. In fact, more Spitfires were built than any other British aircraft before or since. Not surprisingly then, the Spitfire has become a very valuable aeroplane indeed. The restoration of Spitfires has grown into a multi-million-pound industry. For the operators and pilots that bring these iconic fighters back from the dead, it is a great responsibility, as they are also guardians of the nation's heritage.
Well, it's a beautiful looking thing. I mean, it's a sexy aeroplane, there's no question about that. It looks right from every angle. It was involved in the classic battle of recent times, the Battle of Britain, and no one forgets it. Not at the moment, you know. It's still very much in recent memory, even though it was 60, 70 years ago. It's still something that we know all about and want to know about.
Everybody has some idea of the Spitfire and what it did and what it achieved and what it represents now. That is the one thing, isn't it, that the Spitfire appeals to all levels. I mean, whether you're 8 years old or you're 80 years old, you know, well, certainly in England, in this country, you know what a Spitfire is, and most people know what it did. I think it's very important. I think a sense of identity, a sense of history of our country is extremely important. Otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we?
That any Spitfires have survived is quite remarkable. During the Second World War, they were not expected to last more than a few weeks.
Nobody expected these aeroplanes to be still flying 70, 75 years later. I mean, it was just, you know, nothing furthest from their thoughts, I'm sure, you know, by a million miles at that point. But, you know, you have to look at it in the context of that period, of that time. It didn't really matter.
Preparing for such longevity was never a consideration for those who designed and built these aircraft. But where does the story of this design icon begin? As its designer, Reginald Mitchell will forever be remembered for his most famous creation. Mitchell had gained international renown for leading the design team at Supermarine, which had produced a succession of racing float planes. In 1931, one of these aircraft won the coveted Schneider Trophy for the third time in a row, an unrivaled success at a time when aviation prowess was held in as high regard by the public as sporting achievement is today.
Mitchell was a very fair man. He was very impressive as a person. He was a very good listener. And he was very decisive. He would listen, though. He was quite prepared to listen to all the arguments. And of course, you know, there's always, or very often, there's more than one way to solve a problem. But he did actually make decisions based on listening to people.
What was nice about Mitchell, again, was that he always said it was, don't congratulate me about something. My men are the chaps who deserve the compliments and so on. And he always did that so nicely, I think.
Using the wealth of experience he had gained in high-speed flight, Mitchell turned his mind to designing a fighter. In the mid-1930s, Britain's Royal Air Force and most foreign air forces flew fabric-covered biplanes with fixed undercarriages and open cockpits. When the Spitfire made its maiden flight on March 5, 1936, it was therefore something of a revelation. It was a streamlined monoplane constructed almost entirely of metal. The cockpit was enclosed and it had a retractable undercarriage.
It was the D-type Jaguar that became my favourite car, and one that we were heavily involved in restoring. And the similarities between that and the Spitfire are really quite incredible. In my opinion, the link between the D-type and the Spitfire is the very similar ways they were constructed and designed. And one had a monocoque fuselage, the other had a monocoque centre section in the car. They both had tubular subframes, and they both had a classic engine in them. In the case of the Jaguar, it was the XK engine, the six-cylinder, and of course in the Spitfire it was the Merlin engine. But really the real synergy between the two is the fact that they were fantastic looking machines. They were set out, the designers set out with one purpose in mind, and that was to win.
Rolls-Royce had also developed a new engine for the aircraft called the PV-12. This would later be given the name Merlin. This was one of the great engines of all time, and versions of it went on to power other successful aircraft. Two Merlins helped power the de Havilland Mosquito, and four of them made the Avro Lancaster one of the most capable bombers of the Second World War. Today, it is as much the sound of the Merlin as well as the look of a Spitfire that arouses the senses, with a heady cocktail of noise and speed, an experience that once seen is never forgotten.
Well, I was a 5-year-old on a camping holiday with my father, and we heard this sort of roaring overhead, and he pulled me out the tent and said, "Look, there's a flight of Spitfires coming overhead. Look at them, remember, and listen to the sound of them, because you're never going to hear it again. They're going to be disbanded shortly." I looked up and saw this group of Spitfires flying overhead, and it looked fantastic, and the noise was inspiring, and my father said, "Listen to it, because that is the sound of freedom."
Even in 1936, the Spitfire beguiled all who saw her. Indeed, trials had barely started when the RAF placed an order for 310 aircraft.
It was unique because most low-wing monoplanes behave perfectly in the air, but many of the low-wing monoplanes, when you came into land, depending on your load configuration, would be a little bit tricky on the actual touchdown due to the flow from the wings over the empennage. But the Spitfire, by virtue of its wing, the little twist in the wing, the flow over the empennage, you could land that under any conditions with a high angle of attack for a 3-point landing, and unless a silly thing like a camera door on the root end of the starboard wing was open, it would put down absolutely perfectly. Now, the first time I flew the Spitfire, to me it was straight away, it's a thoroughbred.
But by now, Mitchell had died, tragically young, of cancer, and it was his successor, Joe Smith, who would see the Spitfire into production, and indeed through its entire life. Such was the pace of development that by the time production ended in 1949, the Spitfire had an engine that delivered more than twice the power of the original. Its maximum takeoff weight may have more than doubled, but so had its rate of climb, and its firepower had increased 5-fold.
The spirit never went. Joe Smith and all the team that I knew so well around him, they did a marvellous job. But you see, their problem, which Mitchell would have come up against, you see, the Spitfire was a marvellous aircraft within a certain speed range. The worst problem with the Spitfire, it high performance were the ailerons. Spitfire at over 400 miles an hour became very heavy on the ailerons, and it was the freeze type aileron, and they had to design a new wing both for firepower and for aileron control. And when they switched over to the Mark 21, then the aircraft itself was really no longer a Spitfire as we knew it. But having said that, whereas the old type of Spitfire with the freeze type aileron went solid in a dive on aileron loading, with the Mark 21 C546 and that upwards, with a servo tap aileron, a different type of wing, literally the faster you went, the better the aileron control became. But as opposed to that, lower down the scale, if you flew the aircraft slowly, then you didn't have the aileron control anywhere near as good as the original Spitfire. It was a compromise in effect.
But turning a hand-built prototype into an aircraft that could be mass-produced was not so straightforward.
The nature of the structure of the Spitfire was probably fairly typical, if you like, of sort of 1930s, probably the English-British way of thinking about making parts. A similar rib on count the parts in this rib, you'll probably come to 25, 30 separate pieces. The contemporary German aeroplane at the time, the Messerschmitt 109, would have just been a one-piece pressing. They'd have just made a great big press tool and knocked it out on a big press. They seem to concentrate really on the tooling aspect of it and not much labour as an element, whereas we seem to be, in the mindset we had obviously plenty of labour available, and all these little tiny detail parts were made all over the factory and then assembled finally, and we seem to have used 20 people to make one rib, where the Germans and perhaps later the Americans, when the Mustang went into production, really had it almost on an assembly line thing, which later became the norm, of course. But the Spitfire never did. I mean, they were made like this from 1936 to really for the next 10 years. I think obviously perhaps, you know, when the factories were dispersed to all the various satellite things, and I think there's sort of 40 different major subcontractors, as well as probably a myriad of much, much smaller ones, then this type of structure lent itself to be able to be done in the most sort of, you know, really basic workshops, to be quite honest. Whereas if the German assembly shops were ever bombed and the big presses were hit, then they were absolutely stuck for production. Whereas we just merely moved benches and set up somewhere else, and the continuity then was ensured. So, I mean, this type of structure obviously does have its merits. Plus the fact it's, you know, the other side of it, I guess it's easy to repair. I mean, if half of this rib got damaged in combat, you take that bit out, a couple of the diagonals, put a new bit in. If it was a one-piece thing, obviously, then the whole thing would have to come out, necessitating perhaps the wing being broken down further and repairs taking much longer.
In August 1938, No. 19 Squadron at Duxford became the first RAF unit to be equipped with the new aircraft, now designated the Mark I. A year later, when war broke out in September 1939, 306 Spitfires equipped 10 squadrons.
Most delightful aeroplane to fly. You didn't get in it, you strapped it on. And it was a friendly aeroplane, wouldn't let you down.
I taxied out past the Spitfire up on its nose and took off. Bloody marvellous. You felt you'd been flying it all your bloody life.
Again, a lovely aeroplane. It was lovely to fly, but it had two disadvantages. Well, one disadvantage, which one could see in two different occasions. One was that if you tried to pull up after you'd landed, because you were short of runway or grass, whatever it was, many people tipped up in the nose because the centre of gravity was so near the wheels.
Yes, I wanted to fly fighters, not necessarily Spitfires, but we went on to Spitfires at Howden in Cheshire, and just had a fortnight to switch to Spitfires, which was very, very interesting, because after the master, although the master was quite powerful, opening up the throttle of the Spitfire was like a kick in the back. It was really, you could really feel the boost. And they were nice and light and easy to fly, except they had this pump action, getting the wheels up, getting the flaps up. You could always tell the newcomers at the place by watching the airfield, the aircraft going round the circuit, sort of leapfrogging, as people tried to pump the flaps up or down, ready for the landing.
And suddenly, 1st of March, Ben's gone, Spitfire. We had to go and get them. We're going to have Spitfires. So we each tootled off to somewhere in the middle of the country and were shown the Spitfire and said, "There it is, take it away." So that was quite amusing because you probably know that to get the undercarriage off, you had to work. It didn't come up by itself. You had a lever, like a brake handle, and you pumped this to and fro. So when you took off, you started with your right hand on the stick and your left hand on the throttle. You shoved it forward. When you got off the ground, you had to change over and hold the stick with your left hand and pump with your right. The result was that when one went forward, the other went back. So when you saw somebody off on his first sail, inevitably, once the wheels began coming up, it would hunt up and down like this.
And it was don't be sitting on the ground here, so the boil very quickly. Only your legs in the way. Get it in the air. And so very carefully I taxied out and swing the nose so you can see where you're going. And I got the end of it was a grass aerodrome. I got the end of the aerodrome and turned into wind and opened the throttle. Oh God, and it went. I've never known anything like it. This vast acceleration and power. But it was doing everything wrong. I went between the hangars because I had trimmed it the wrong way around. Anyway, that didn't matter. I got in the air and I looked at, I'm climbing. I looked at the airspeed indicator. I'm looking at all the instruments, trying to discern what's this, what's that. And the airspeed indicator was showing 180 miles an hour, and I'm climbing. I thought, bloody hell, what an airplane this is.
I felt about the Spitfire that it was a beautiful aeroplane, that it flew very nicely, it was quite fast, and there was a good chance that in that you could shoot down some enemy aircraft. There was also quite a good chance, if you learnt to fly it properly, that you could evade them shooting you down. It was, I don't know, you felt a sense of joy at flying the Spitfire. I think every time I got into a Spitfire and flew it, I felt a sense of joy.
But it was a year later, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over England, that the Spitfire earned its place in history and in the hearts of the nation. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight serves as a flying memorial to all RAF personnel who have lost their lives in conflict. But regardless of its achievements since, the public tacitly recognises the Battle of Britain as the RAF's finest hour. And although the Hurricanes were more numerous and shot down more enemy aircraft, it is the Spitfire that has become the iconic symbol of defiance. The flight has 5 Spitfires, of which the Mark II is particularly special. Not only is she the oldest Spitfire in the world still flying, she also actually fought during the Battle of Britain. Indeed, she still carries the scars in the form of repaired bullet holes on her port wing. The Mark II was essentially the same aircraft as the Mark I, but with a slightly more powerful engine. Just 4 years earlier, the Spitfire had made her maiden flight as a hand-built prototype. Now she had been transformed into a fighting aeroplane. Already there had been some changes. The flat canopy of the prototype now had a bulge added to stop, it is said, pilots banging their heads when moving around rough ground. In reality, it would give pilots better all-round visibility during air combat. Although armoured plating had also been added to the cockpit to protect the pilot, he still sat behind the fuel tank. This meant that a direct hit exposed him to the flames, which is why many pilots suffered such horrific burns during combat.
If you believe that today is going to be a picnic, you will be there in superior numbers and you're going to have a good time, you want to look good, do it in a Spitfire. If you think the odds are stacked against you, it's all going to be terribly bloody and you don't want to be there, do it in a Hurricane. And the reason for that is that, well, a lot of people don't realise Hurricane will actually outperform Spitfires, 109s, anything you want to name at certain bits of the envelope, much more restricted bits of the envelope than a Spitfire. But it is no mean fighter. It is a much better gun platform in that it's much more stable than a Spitfire. But I think most pertinently, a Hurricane will absorb much more punishment and still make it back. And that is the reason that guys say, you know, on a bad day, go in a Hurricane.
Its designated role was as a defensive fighter, and for this purpose the Spitfire was armed with 8 Browning machine guns. The Spitfire's slim wings meant that there was room for only 300 rounds for each gun. A 3-second burst of fire could deliver a punch weighing in at around 8 pounds. In 1939, this was considered impressive, but by the time the Spitfire met the enemy in 1940, German aircraft were equipped with protective armour plating. But the Browning's rate of fire meant that the Spitfire's actual fighting time was limited to around 15 seconds before it ran out of ammo. However, the Spitfire also had incendiary bullets, which had been invented in great secrecy just before the battle. These could ignite an enemy fuel tank or at least show if the pilot was hitting his target. Another problem was that ice formed in the gun mechanisms, causing them to jam. A simple solution to this problem was to cover the gun ports with red square patches of waxed fabric. This would then clear once the first round was fired.
We had to get into about 250 feet, which is very close and fairly bumpy because you got into the slipstream of these things. But that was the only doctrine we got: get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
The first time I fired my guns in anger was at 150 plus Heinkels over Maidstone. And that was the first time that I started to know what it was all about.
Well, in fact, we flew 20 hours on Spitfires. I think it was 20 hours on the Spitfires before we went to a squadron. And that doesn't give you very much time to do much more than become accustomed to the aircraft. And even then, you're not fully able to take advantage of all its abilities, and every time you fly it, you experiment in a different way. And so, to an extent, I suppose you were taught. I can't remember really, but I suppose one was taught how to evade being shot down. I think mainly, however, you were taught how to, as a interceptor aircraft, you were taught how to intercept and how to shoot other aircraft down.
We knew that the squadrons were short of pilots and they wanted some reinforcements as quickly as possible. On the other hand, there was no point in sending chaps down to them who hadn't had any or sufficient training to make them of some use and help to the squadrons. So I suppose the shortest time that some of the chaps were with us was about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And by that time they'd flown the Spitfire, because we were a Spitfire OTU, as the other two were Hurricanes, and they'd flown the Spitfire. They knew what it was like to fly in formation. We gave them some opportunity to fire the guns. We had targets in the sea, in the River Dee down there, and we tried to give them some idea of what was required of them once they joined a squadron. And what you can learn in 2 to 3 weeks is not a great deal, but nevertheless, they'd flown Spitfires and had some competence on the aircraft.
The 303 we had 8 303s firing 20 rounds a second per gun. They were all armour-piercing and armour-piercing incendiary, and you could see these exploding on the aircraft's wings, but a lot of the time they did not appear to be doing any damage.
The 8 machine guns that we had with the Hurricanes and Spitfires out in the wings there, they had to be harmonised, and there were 2 harmonisations that were discussed by ourselves and by the armourers. One was spot harmonisation, to get as many bullets into one small area as possible, or to spread the overall area.
As far as I'm concerned, I never aimed at the pilot. My aim was to knock the aircraft down. And if the pilot got injured, that was a shame, but there we are.
But time was not on the RAF side. On May the 10th, 1940, the Germans launched their attack to seal their grip on Western Europe. By the end of the month, the remains of the British Expeditionary Force and units of the French Army were waiting on the beaches of Dunkirk to be rescued. RAF commanders resisted repeated calls to send Spitfires over to France, as that battle was all but lost. Fighter Command had already lost some 25% of its fighting strength, and so it was essential that aircraft, and even more importantly pilots, were kept back for the even greater battle to come.
I don't think we could have done any more than we did. There's a book being read about it, and the main thing is that we were so few. When you remember how far we had to fly, because of our endurance, we didn't have long-range tanks. We could only have perhaps an hour, perhaps less, over there. And to try and keep that up in May, which is sunshine from 5:30 in the morning till, 10, 11 at night, how could we be there all the time? And my impression of those early days anyway was that there's very little cooperation and discussion of tactics. That came much later. You're just there and you just piled in. We just discovered how that's what happened, because you'd be tooling about over Dunkirk, mind your own business, looking around. But if you saw any aircraft, you immediately had to try and recognise it, of course. And if it was enemy, you'd say where it was, and you might be told what to do, but after 1 or 2 sorties, if you waited for that, they'd gone. So the form usually was, you say where they were, and went straight down. And we weren't flying in pairs in those days, so you're on your own.
During the grim summer and autumn of 1940, the men and women of RAF Fighter Command faced their toughest challenge. At stake was nothing less than Britain's survival. Without control of the skies, the Germans could not attempt an invasion. As they had considerably more aircraft, they tried to engage the RAF in a war of attrition. On August 13th, 1940, the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, began its assault to destroy the RAF. British radar and observers could track the size and direction of the attacking aircraft, but it was up to the Spitfires and Hurricanes to actually stop them. The attacks came in several times a day. With both men and machines sorely stretched, RAF commanders had to marshal their resources carefully, only sending up the minimum number of aircraft into the fight. They knew they could not win a war of attrition.
Tiredness was very much with you. And when, for instance, at Biggin Hill we had huts, we had some beds there, which you used to lie on. And when you first came on readiness, I can't remember what dawn readiness was at the time, so it was 5:30, and you sometimes lay on the bed until you were scrambled. But it's tiredness, oblique tension. Waiting for that telephone to ring was the most exhausting part of being a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. When it rang, the message may be, the naffy's here with tea, which was you enjoyed the tea, but somewhat shattering. When it rang and you were scrambled, it was a wonderful relief. Once you were strapped in the aircraft, in it, then you felt, you know, we're on our way, we're doing something.
In those days we used to be called at 3:30 in the morning, breakfast at 4, when you really feel like having breakfast, and then it was down to dispersal.
In the end, you didn't think about it, you were tired. I could always see dawn readiness. I can see the Spitfire standing in the gloom at dispersal. I can hear the airmen and the clank of petrol bowsers, you know, and I can remember sort of looking up at the sky and thinking, oh, it's going to be a lovely day again. Oh God, another dawn, you know.
Readiness started at daybreak or dawn, and the first squad raids were never known to be mounted up that early, so one flight would be detailed to go on readiness at dawn.
It was a funny sort of time. You just sort of fool around. I think we had a football we knocked around with. We looked forward to the second breakfast, and the tea when the naffy arrived with the tea and that sort of thing. But you were sitting there really dreading the telephone ringing. Sometimes it was sometimes just to tell you that the naffy had arrived, but more often than not it was a scramble.
Day after day, they would square up to the Luftwaffe's fighters, the Messerschmitt 109. This aircraft too had a racing pedigree, and with 2 cannons it was slightly better armed. But the Spitfire was faster at the lower altitudes where much of the fighting took place.
With regard to combat flying, the one thing you always needed if you were going to survive was speed. Because when you were attacked, you went into a tight turn, which immediately made your speed drop virtually to nil. In fact, stall if bullets were whistling. So then you had to get speed, and the only way was to dive down and aspire to get the speed up.
I don't remember having a dogfight that lasted very long, because eventually you'd get on his tail and then he'd dive away, you see. In fact, my experience of generally of 109s is that they always wanted to get away, funnily enough. They didn't want to engage. So you were either caught yourself and didn't have much option, or you had a few moments, or you caught him without being seen, or you got a shot or two and then away you went. And you'd be very lucky if you could, if you're already behind, be able to catch up. I had several occasions, full bore, going down, and sometimes, occasionally getting a little bit nearer, mostly not being able to.
Also at high speeds, the Spitfire's controls did not get as heavy as the Messerschmitts. Thus the Spitfire pilot could dive away and pull up much later than the enemy. And in a turning battle, the Spitfire's famous elliptical wing gave the pilot more warning of an impending stall, which again gave him greater control in the combat zone. At the start of the battle, Fighter Command's tactics proved to be woefully impractical for the circumstances in which the pilots found themselves. Pilots had been drilled to fly in neat V-shaped formations, or VICs of 3 aircraft. As the pilots were supposed to fly no more than 100 yards apart, it meant they spend as much time watching their flight leader as looking out for the enemy.
The form was that when you took off, you joined up, and there were 2 flights, and each flight had 6 aircraft, so there were 4 threes, so to speak. In the event, there'd be 3 threes in line astern, and 1 in the box, and 2 of that last would be weaving above, trying to keep up a little bit ahead, and they'd be watching your tail. And I think in '92, if I'm not right, we continued with that well into the Battle of Britain.
Certainly Fighter Command discovered that the Vic-3 was not a particularly... in fact, it was not a good formation to fly, if only because when you were flying in the 3, you were flying quite close, and you had to spend most of your attention making sure you didn't hit the aircraft you were formating on.
any fighter pilot who goes into the sky and doesn't look at the sky is asking for trouble, even in England at the time. Now, we used to scan the sky quite a lot, because in those days, you remember, it was 3 Vic formation. And in a Vic formation, you can't take your eyes off the leader very much. Otherwise, there's going to be collision. So we used to keep our eyes over there and up there and in the mirror.
This method of attack, devised in peacetime, presupposed the bombers were unescorted. In reality, the German fleets were heavily escorted, even though the fighters only had a short time in which to fight due to their high fuel consumption. Once the Spitfires locked combat with the 109s, all thoughts of neat formation flying generally went out of the window.
When I first went into battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly in my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, "break," that meant we were being attacked. And I broke a steep turn, to left or right, and I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron. A dogfight was chaos for a matter of almost a minute or 2 minutes. Occasionally you chased something. I'm talking about fighters against fighters now. Occasionally you chase something, which obviously you could chase them for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. But the actual dogfight itself, something flashed across your gun sight, you fired your guns, hope you'd hit.
But despite the pilots' high morale and commitment, losses were becoming critical. Aircraft could be patched up or even replaced, but it took longer to train up a pilot. The pressure on fighter command was reaching breaking point, and the pilots exhausted.
In respect of fear, it was not mentioned between pilots. We all put on a great performance that sort of tally-ho after the enemy, chase the enemy. But it was one great performance, really.
The Battle of Britain reached its climax on the afternoon of September the 15th, 1940. The Luftwaffe sent its greatest concentration of aircraft yet seen over the English coast. Over 1,000 bombers and their fighter escorts headed towards London's Docklands. Fighter Command threw every available aircraft into the fray, but the best they could muster was less than 500. Yet despite the enormous odds and the exhaustion of months of continual flying, the pilots' morale remained high. From the ground, the fighter controllers brilliantly brought all the squadrons to battle, which ranged from the east of London all the way down to the coast. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost some 56 aircraft to the RAF's 6 Spitfires and 20 Hurricanes. The impact of the German losses went way beyond the actual numbers. At their briefings, they had been told that the RAF was on the verge of defeat, perhaps down to its last 50 fighters. The window of opportunity in which the Germans could mount an invasion was closing fast. By October, the tides and weather would not be so favourable. As the RAF was far from defeated, Hitler ordered a postponement of the invasion to the following year. In reality, the idea was never resurrected. The Battle of Britain was RAF Fighter Command's finest hour.
The constant bombing, mortal combat, and the threat of invasion. In September 1940, those things were very real indeed, believe me.
I didn't realise I was part of history. I was just someone trying to do my little bit and survive. And that was it. The bigger picture didn't exist.
when one had time to think about it, which you didn't then. You had other things to think about, self-preservation. But when you had time to think about it, you realised that the chips were relatively down. No quarter asked or given against an utterly ruthless and evil regime, and they had to be stopped.
You knew that the odds were sort of loaded against you, but you hated the Germans so much you were going to kill them before the bastards could kill me. That was the sort of attitude. It was absolute hatred of the Germans.
I suppose I was scared. I think we did our best at the time, and I was lucky enough to survive.
With the benefit of hindsight, the Spitfire was the right aircraft in the right place at the right time. Not only had R.J. Mitchell's little fighter won over the hearts of friends, it had also built a formidable reputation amongst its enemies. Today, the Spitfire still inspires admiration. The events that created the Spitfire's reputation may now be passing out of living memory, but we can still bask in the warm glow of the achievements of an older generation. Whenever a Spitfire displays in front of the public, a reverential hush descends over the crowd as senses soak up the sight and sound of this most graceful of machines. To most gazing skywards, a Spitfire is a Spitfire. There may have been 24 different marks, but at the end of the day, they all represent the same thing: victory. So enduring is the Spitfire's popularity that a vibrant industry has grown up to restore and operate them.
Because of the availability of Spitfire engineering drawings, and a lot of the Spitfire is available on engineering drawings, not all of it, and the experience built up, you really need no more than a data plate now. Merlin engines seem to have popped out of the woodwork. There's very few parts on the Spitfire that can't be made in using relatively simple tools. It was an aircraft designed to be made on a kitchen table. You know, there's thousands and thousands of little bits rather than big pressing. So it's actually a relatively easy aeroplane to restore, or, if the truth be known, remanufacture, because that's really what we're doing. You can very rarely use much of the original aircraft. So a data plate is all you need today.
Now, the length of time it takes to build a fuselage now, I guess we hopefully got it down to round about a year, but it obviously does depend on the start point. Having said that, I mean, if a fuselage comes to us as a complete item already, it still has to be stripped, cleaned, inspected, you know, even if everything is going back together and it ends up being 99% what came in the door. But if we're building one from what is now accepted, I guess, as being a starter project kit, which would be sort of, you know, a few large boxes of parts. By the time we've actually restored what we start with and then filled in the gaps, so to speak, it's probably somewhere then between 12 to 14, 12 to 16 months. Once we've actually got a project to start and we've had delivered the remnants of the aeroplane, then we'll go through the obvious gaps. In this particular case, we're doing some frames for a Mark V for a customer of ours in Yorkshire, and we've just done the blanks for the bare frames. This is one of the blanks water knifed out to one of our templates. It's just a flat sheet at the moment, as you can see. And here's one that's actually in the first stage of being formed on the block, which Jake's just sort of done the flange and he's just finishing right now. The earlier marks didn't change very significantly. The Mark 1 really through to the Mark 9 is very much the same basic structure. The later marks, the heavier the engines, the heavier the armament became, the more equipment in the fuselage. They did put strengthening plates, material thicknesses increased somewhat, but it wasn't really until the later marks, the Griffon engined aeroplanes came along, that there were what you'd call some more significant changes. Things were then beefed up. There were skin gauges increased, some frames differed very slightly. The fin itself became larger to cope with the bigger engine, so the fin units on the later aeroplanes are very different. And also with the wings, I mean, the spars were increased lengthwise for the cutouts of the tubes, so that gave a significant increase in the strength of the spar. This is the fuselage of a Mark 1 Spitfire that we're currently storing for one of our customers, and it's sort of at the bare bones stage, as you can see now, prior to basically coming out the jig, going off for painting and skinning. This is an extremely rare aeroplane. It was recovered from a beach in France after forced landing there during the Battle of France in May 1940. Was recovered by the French in the 1980s and has lived in various museums since then, and was bought by its present owner about 5-6 years ago, and has come to us for the fuselage to be restored.
When this Mark 1 is finished, it will be the oldest airworthy Spitfire in the world. But at present, that accolade belongs to a Mark 2, operated by the RAF Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. As it actually took part in the battle, it holds a special place in the world of Spitfires.
I think we've all got our own favourites. I particularly like flying the baby Spitfires, the Merlin engine 2 and the 5. The 2 because it's such a beautiful, precious aeroplane that to fly something that flew in the Battle of Britain and such an iconic aeroplane, such an iconic time, that is a privilege beyond measure to do that. The Mark 5 is actually probably the nicest flying of all of them, I think. It's really is a beautifully balanced aeroplane that just feels lovely. But they're all great. I mean, it's an honour to have to get into any of them, frankly.
Of the early Marks, the most numerous are the Marks 5 and 9, and both are well represented today. The development of the Mark 5 followed the closing stages of the Battle of Britain. With the threat of invasion subsiding, the RAF began mounting attacks in France. Fighters were sent over the English Channel to shoot up airfields and other more opportunistic targets. It was risky work, as a successful attack relied on speed and firepower. The Spitfire's elegant elliptical wings were not ideal for low-level manoeuvring, and it needed to pack a bigger punch than the machine guns allowed. The Mark V entered service in February 1941 and could carry a combination of machine guns and cannon. Its low-level manoeuvrability was improved by clipping the wingtips so that the Spitfire could roll more quickly. Very large numbers of Mark Vs were built and operated in theatres all over the world. For example, in North Africa, they flew as part of the Western Desert Air Force. The elegance of the nose had to be sacrificed in favour of a large bulge housing filters to keep the sand out of the engine. Spitfires were also operated by air forces other than the RAF. The Soviet Union was one beneficiary, the Red Star replacing the proud roundels on over 140 Spitfires during 1943. The Mark V was also the first Spitfire to go to sea. Although her fighting capabilities were beyond question, the Spitfire was not the ideal choice for carrier operations, even with an arrestor hook added. As was borne out later in the war, successful carrier aircraft had to be rugged to withstand the inevitable hard landings on carrier decks. The first Seafire was designated Mark I. Later, the Royal Navy was to receive fully navalised Seafires, which were strengthened to cope with the violence of launching by catapult. The undercarriage was also raked forward to stop the aircraft tipping over while holding the full power necessary for takeoff. But perhaps the most obvious difference was that the Seafire was given folding wings so that more aircraft could be stored below decks. Coming up against a new German fighter and losing. That fighter was the Focke-Wulf 190. The air superiority enjoyed by the Allies over the Channel and northern France began to swing back in the Luftwaffe's favour. But fate intervened in June 1942. While returning from a raid, a German pilot landed his FW-190 at West Malling in Kent, mistaking the RAF airfield for his base in France. Following a series of mock combat tests, a new Spitfire entered service, the Mark 9. This Spitfire was every bit the equal to the FW-190 and generally superior to the latest development of the Messerschmitt 109. Although it was only intended as a stopgap, more Mark 9s were produced than any other Spitfire, and its manufacture continued right up until the end of the war. Its Merlin 61 engine was 1.5 times more powerful than the Mark 1s. In 1944, it was joined by the almost identical Mark 16, which was powered by a Merlin built under license in the United States by the Packard Company. Some of the later Mark 9s and 16s also had a teardrop canopy and cutback rear fuselage, which improved the pilot's visibility, something that had been a problem since the start of the war.
You couldn't see straight ahead on the ground at all, and people happened to collide with other people. And in the air, the disadvantage was that you really couldn't, if you had to take a deflection shot of anything like 15 degrees or more, you wouldn't be seeing, if you were taking a correct shot, you wouldn't be seeing your target at all, because it would be underneath the nose. The amount of lead you'd have to give on it would be underneath the nose. And there again, I think that one reason why Hurricane pilots perhaps scored as many as they did compared with Spitfire, that they could see what they were shooting at, but the Spitfire pilot couldn't unless he was more or less behind.
The Mark 9 was the last of the Merlin line, and for many, the last of the true Spitfires.
Mark 9 was still a Spitfire, aileron controls, elevators and what have you, the same as all the previous models, virtually speaking. But you see, with the aircraft below the Mark 9, you peaked your power, varied with engines, but let's say you peaked your power at 15,000 feet. And from then on, your power was diminishing the higher you got, which against the FW-190 and the Messerschmitt 109, they had the power upstairs, and of course their performance was better. And it was only when the Merlin was fitted with this two-stage blower, so that instead of losing your power, let's say 15,000 feet or above, it carried on with another stage blower, which although I think it took 300 horsepower itself to drive the blower, gave it far more power than any Spitfire had previously had, and that's why it came as such a shock to the Germans that when they were intercepting at, say, any height above 20,000 feet, the performance of the Mark 9 was equal or if not better to theirs, and of course they got a tremendous shock.
A far rarer sight today is that of the Griffin-powered Marks. With the end of the war approaching, the Allies enjoyed air superiority right across Europe. They also had a wider choice of aircraft, such as the P-51 Mustang, which also used the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. As a result, fewer Griffin Spitfires were built. Although the Mark 12 was the first Griffin Spitfire, the Mark 14 was the more numerous. This was followed into service during 1944 by the Mark 19. This was the last Spitfire to serve operationally in the RAF, flying in the reconnaissance role during the Malaya campaign in 1954. One of the BBMF Mark 19s wears the colour scheme of the aircraft today, with the slogan, "The Last," emblazoned across its nose. The full-throated roar of these machines give the Spitfire an altogether more aggressive aura.
lot of people I know say, well, you know, as soon as you put a Griffin in, it's not a Spitfire anymore. Well, that, frankly, is not so. Because the nose grows by 4 feet, which actually, in aesthetic terms, to my mind, actually makes it a more attractive looking aeroplane. The entire fuselage and fin and rudder are absolutely pure Spitfire. I mean, you could look at, there's nothing else like it at all. But more importantly than anything else, the wing never changes. The wing remains that absolutely pure ellipse that it always was. So, you know, I see what they say, that just as I believe that at about the Mark 5 or the 9, you run out of the concept of an armed sport plane, which is clearly good fun, and you run into the absolute warbird, which is not quite as much fun. They are all absolutely Spitfires.
Spitfire displays are always a highlight at air shows. This iconic aircraft is arguably one of the most recognisable shapes in the world. And with that recognition comes a deep sense of history and heritage, as each one flying today has its own unique story. Owning, let alone flying such an iconic machine is a dream for many, but realised by few.
I suppose the roots go back to childhood and being, interested in aeroplanes. And if you are interested in aeroplanes, then the Spitfire is a pretty obvious one to be particularly interested in. It's obviously an iconic British aircraft, and for that reason, I think if you think of the Second World War and aeroplanes, probably the first aeroplane that would come into anyone's mind is a Spitfire. And I guess that I'm the same. I'm a Brit, so from the time I started thinking about aeroplanes and growing up, Spitfires were there. So the choice of a Spitfire as opposed to any other warbird was a no-brainer for me. It was just the aeroplane to have. Actually coming by it was relatively easy, having decided I wanted to get into rebuilding one. There was a period of a couple of years when I was wondering about whether getting into owning a Spitfire and operating it was a wise thing to do, and it probably isn't. But having put out some feelers about getting hold of one, actually it was not too hard to find the bits and pieces that are necessary to start off on a project.
Although more Spitfires were built than any other British aircraft before or since, relatively few remain flying. Of the 40 or so airworthy Spitfires flying at any one time around the world, there are more Mark 9s flying today than any other Mark. But the almost insatiable demand means that a vibrant Spitfire industry has grown up keeping alive skills that were common over 60 years ago and, some would say, improving on them.
We'd like to think we achieve at least the same standard, if not a higher one, if that's not a heresy to say, because obviously we spend far more time as a percentage. It takes us probably to do a complete fuselage and a pair of wings, you're looking at probably 3 years or so. Obviously each project does vary according to its start point, but it would be an average of somewhere between 2.5 to 3 plus years. And the standards that we have to work to now, because we are rigidly sort of controlled by the CAA, and we have all sorts of quality controls and paperwork trails and traceability and admin that we have to adhere to, which puts more time on. But I'd like to think that we have to work to that higher standard. I mean, the approvals we have means that we can make parts virtually for anything. If somebody wanted us to make a bit for a jumbo jet, we could make a bit for a jumbo jet. We have that system in place. And obviously during the war, the rate of production was by far the most paramount, and they weren't expected to last. The life expectancy is, depending on what sort of documents you read, is something between 25, 30 odd hours as expected combat service life. And when we take originals apart, we'll find packers and shims and washers, where they shouldn't be acting as, but that was fine. I mean, that was acceptable. At their rate of the high production, when they were knocking out literally sort of hundreds over a couple of month period, that had to be, double, treble shifts and whatever. Now, obviously, a lot more. There probably a lot more TLC is used, and And we also have to remember the safety aspect, the integrity, but also that it's somebody's passion that they are spending the thick end or more than £1 million to actually get back in the air. So everything does have to be, you know, as perfect as it can be before it leaves the workshop, of course.
Finding a suitable aircraft for restoration requires a lot of patience, research and a deep pocket.
Well, again, I think any sort of pitfalls from the engineering point of view have been overcome. I mean, you're always going to get little glitches, I mean, probably, but it's more from a commercial point of view. We can do some of our machine parts in-house, but a lot of it, you know, the complicated bits we have to send out. And then you tend to lose control a bit, you get promised deliveries and blah, 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 normal business thing, really. I mean, that's something that I wish perhaps we'd invested in getting our own machine shop set up some years ago. It's too late now, but you know, that's something we should have done perhaps. But there are no real pitfalls to be aware of other than customers' various dictates, you know, where they want guns fitted or they want this fitted or various, you know, different types of fuel tank arrangement, some of which may have been accepted as a Spitfire mod because they did have different fuel tank system, wings, layouts and what have you to give increased range and endurance. Say fitting guns is now almost pretty much the norm to get the original type guns deactivated and put back in. And that's one thing I guess that has changed quite a lot since we've been doing it, that in the 1980s the wings were just, using the wing as an example as we're standing by one, were just skinned over in as many big sheets as you could just to get the wing done and finished. And now people would sort of hold up the sign of the cross at that, saying, no, you know, if it had a panel here, a machine gun thing here, an access door there, and everything actually has to be as it left the factory. You know, authenticity now is absolutely the watchword of certainly all the owners, all the would-be owners, and it's something that we enjoy doing. You know, we enjoy actually trying to put them back exactly as they were. With all the fixtures, fitments, equipment changes and, you know, all the various bits and pieces that they would have been in service with.
The Spitfire's wing is one of the most recognisable of all shapes, and its design is one of the reasons why it survived in service so long.
I think probably the Spitfire wing is it's the elliptical shape, it's the bit that everybody recognises. It sort of has become part of that icon, if you like, that, I mean, the fuselage is a very slim, you know, everything, but I think it's probably when you see the plan form of the aeroplane, it's probably the wing that makes it very distinctive, very recognisable, and which was achieved really by, as we always say, there's not really one straight line on a Spitfire anywhere, fuselage, tail, and especially it's true of the wing. The main challenge to us on wings over the years has really been spars. I mean, the strength, the secret of probably the Spitfire wing success, because of the actual depth between the spars is only sort of a few inches. The Hurricane, for example, is twice the thickness, which made it very, very, you know, streamlined for the time. And we've managed to, over 20 odd years, to be the sole supplier of sort of Spitfire spars, spar tubes. Now, you know, we've invested, you know, huge amounts of money in tooling and the ability to produce these square sections, and the telescopic design of which really sort of gave the wing its great integrity and strength. I've got a small offcut here of one that we've made fairly recently, where you can actually see the interlocking 5 different size tubes with the 1.5-inch bar in the middle, which when bent then locks the 6-degree dihedral in place. And this is prior to us, after having made the thing, going off for heat treatment. But that gives you some idea, and it works in a very effective way. And really, I suppose that was the most innovative thing about the wing design, as far as we're concerned. The technology of the 1930s sort of leapt forward with this design, and I suppose that is really the secret of the wing success. They did actually try on one of the later marks, the Mark 18, to have a solid spar, which was basically still the same 2.5-inch square section, but extruded or machined from a solid. But they only ever used it on the Mark 18, and then they dropped it when they went back to the 19s onwards. So you know, I think expense and weight didn't help, but no, the interlocking tubes, you know, really, you know, they stayed as successful as they were really from the first day.
But after all the heartache and hours spent on restoring a Spitfire to flight, there can be few more satisfying moments than seeing your Spitfire take to the skies.
Well, that is an incredibly nervous moment, and I describe it to people as the male equivalent of having a baby. And, you know, when you see your baby fly for the first time, it is incredibly tense. It's, you know, the best bit of it when it alights safely and the pilot gets out and, you know, you have a talk about the minor things that have gone wrong or that need changing. It's a fantastic moment, it really is. Every first flight is imprinted firmly in my brain.
Flying a Spitfire at a display carries a considerable burden of responsibility. After all, these are old aircraft, and so they need to be handled with safety in mind. And as every Spitfire flying represents an enormous investment in time and money, they need to be flown so as not to overstress the airframe and engine. But even with those limitations, there is no reason why the Spitfire cannot continue to beguile both pilots and spectators alike for many years to come.
One of the most important things is people do like to photograph the aeroplane. And when you look along the crowd line at any display, you'll see more camera lenses than eyes almost. And so it's quite important to have, as part of the display, shots of the aircraft flying along the crowd line so people can photograph a top view of it. There are elements of a display that show the Spitfire to its best, and you know, you hear people say wow all the time that happens, and it's but you know, you need to be immensely experienced and absolutely sure of what you're doing to display an aircraft like that. And other people have got their own views, but a gentle series of loops and of course that final victory roll as the aircraft disappears is quite important. It is everyone's favourite aeroplane at air shows. There's no question about it. I mean, we do air shows up and down the country, and although we've got other aircraft and Hurricane and a few other things, it's always the Spitfire that everyone wants, and I think it will remain like that forever. I really don't think it'll change. It is an iconic aeroplane.
Because I suppose perhaps Britain is more aware of its history than most other nations are, it is relatively recent in that there are still obviously a fair number of people around, but on a diminishing basis, who actually participated. But I think more than anything else, people are entertained more by things with which there is a direct human contact. Now, by that I mean that if you fly in a Tornado, you are largely a systems manager. The aeroplane can actually fly itself better than you can. And I would actually put it down to that the aeroplanes look good. I mean, there is, for my money, certainly nothing that looks better than a Spitfire. And I think people relate to the sort of human interface with those machines where you do everything for yourself. I mean, you navigate it, you fly it. If it was war, then you do all that all on your own. And I think it is that element of it which people find so attractive. And I know it must be very disappointing to turn up at a display in a 40 million quid jet and nobody wants to look at it because they want to look at a Spitfire.
Our preference is to use current RAF pilots who have got a good grasp of tailwheel aeroplanes. But to get to that stage, you had to go through a number of other aircraft, and you had to have, I mean, our favourite trainer is the Chipmunk because its handling and circuit pattern for landing is similar to a Spitfire, a lot of to a high degree. But we want to see a lot of hours in Chipmunks, some in Harvards, and of course ultimately the two-seater Spitfire.
In your first season, you fly all the Merlins. You start on the Hurricane and then graduate to the Clipwing Mark 9 Spitfire initially. Then the full span baby ones, which are the hardest actually of the lot to land. But the babies are the hardest. I mean, the Merlin engine full span ones have the same narrow track undercarriage that all Spitfires have, but they have a very small fin and rudder. So actually, it's a real challenge on the ground. In a crosswind, particularly, it's very daunting. And given the preciousness of the aeroplanes, then obviously that makes it doubly demanding in terms of you're very conscious. You cannot mess it up. You've got to get it right.
Well, the various thing, of course, for me, while I was flying it, it was the only aeroplane in the world that was part of oneself. When I said it was like a motorbike, when you're driving a motorbike, you're not saying to yourself, I must lean over here, I must do this. It goes where you want it to go, you don't have to do anything, so to speak. And the Spitfire is just like that.
Surprisingly, all the Marks fly pretty much the same, apart from probably the Griffons, which are that bit heavier. The Mark V at low level will give all the 9s and everything else a very good run for their money.